This is a video about the GCSE Chemistry topic of potable water. This is part of paper 2 for AQA GCSE Combined Science and Chemistry, and it comes up in unit 10. By the end of this video, you should be able to define and contrast potable water and pure water. You should be able to list the key processes in making drinking water, explain the purpose of filtration and sterilisation, describe two methods of desalinating water and explain how to do these, and be able to justify why desalination is rarely used to produce drinking water. We're not going to go into the required practical that comes up in this part of the unit, that will come in a separate video. Potable water is water that is safe to drink. In order to be potable, water needs to not contain any microorganisms that would cause disease, so pathogens. It needs to not contain any toxins that would actually kill us, and it needs low levels of salts. So that's not just table salt, sodium chloride, it's any of those ionic compounds, minerals that water picks up as it moves through rocks. It may contain some other things, like a little bit of those salts and also some fluoride ions. So here in the UK, we add fluoride to our drinking water because having enough fluoride in your diet is really important for good dental health. So this potable water isn't pure water. In chemistry, when we say pure, we mean a single element or a single compound with nothing else added to it at all. So the water that comes out of the tap isn't pure because it has those fluoride ions in it and usually some low levels of salts. But it is potable, it is safe to drink. Earth is covered in water. It's present in the ocean, in lakes, in rivers, and even under the earth in aquifers. Aquifers are pieces of rock that are permeable, so they've got small holes in and water can collect inside as a natural store. We call the water that's stored in this way groundwater, and in order to get it out you need to dig a well. Water can also be collected in reservoirs by damming a river. Some of this water is safe to drink, but lots of it contains high levels of salt, which is toxic to humans because your kidneys can't get rid of that salt without more water to dilute it. Other sources of water contain dangerous microorganisms, pathogens that can cause disease. As part of this unit, you need to discuss how potable water or drinking water can be made from various different sources, starting with everyday groundwater or river water. So to begin with, you need to pick a suitable source. We're going to pick a spring or an aquifer or a river that we don't believe has been contaminated with anything. It's relatively clean already. The next step is going to be screening and grit removal. So in screening, there's a relatively fine metal mesh and the water is passed through that, and that will remove any big foreign objects, so sticks and big pieces of mud and things like that. Then the water is cascaded over a slope, or sometimes it has air bubbled through it to increase the oxygen content. Next up comes a step called coagulation and flocculation, and basically what this is adding a certain chemical that's going to make all the tiny bits of matter join together into bigger chunks, and this makes it much easier to separate out. Then there's the clarification process. So there are two forms this could take. One is just that you leave the water so that all that solid matter is going to settle down, and the other is that you actually use a centrifuge to pull all the small bits down to the bottom and leave the water on top. Then we have another filtration stage to remove any tiny bits of matter that have still made it through all of these stages. Almost at the end, we do sterilisation. So the purpose of sterilisation is to kill any microorganisms that are in the water. It's important that they're going to be killed, they're not going to be removed. So the drinking water that you drink probably has bacteria in it, it's just that they're dead so they can't make you sick. That's kind of gross. So there are three ways that you can sterilise your water. One is by using chlorine gas, so the same way that we sterilise swimming pools. One is by using ozone, which is a special kind of oxygen, and one is by using UV light. And any of those will kill microorganisms and pathogens that are in the water. And then finally, before that water can actually go out into the wider world, it needs to be pH balanced, because if it was acidic or if it was alkaline, then it would degrade the pipes. Now, the three steps I've highlighted here are the most important steps. They're the ones that are named in the specification, and they could ask you to just come up with the name rather than giving you information about it and asking you to interpret them. Time for a quick progress check. Pause the video and write down the answers to these three questions. So hopefully by now you know that potable water is water that is safe to drink. If the water wasn't filtered, then it would contain solid matter, and if it wasn't sterilised, it would contain harmful microorganisms like pathogens. Now that you can describe how to make potable water from groundwater, we need to think about how we can make it from salt water. There's obviously a huge amount of salt water in the world because we have oceans full of it, but it's actually quite hard to make it into water that's safe to drink. Salt water is sometimes called saline. If you've got your ears pierced, then you might have been given some saline in a bottle to clean them with, and all it is salt in boiled water. So the process of removing that salt and stopping it from being saline anymore is called desalination, and there are two different methods that we can use. One is distillation and the other is reverse osmosis. These are both very energy intensive processes, and that makes them really quite expensive. So if we have an option to make potable water from other sources, we tend not to do these. Here's an example of the type of apparatus that you could use to distill water in your lab at school. In the flask, we've got the salty water which needs purifying, and there's a heat source which is used to boil it. I know that the boiling point of water is 100 degrees C, so when the water is boiling, that's the temperature that should show on my thermometer. The salts and other substances that are dissolved in the water have a much higher boiling point. So at 100 degrees, they're not going to have boiled yet, they're still going to be in the flask and they're probably still going to be solids, so they'll be left behind. The water vapour or steam is going to travel up and it's going to go down this tube here through the condenser. A condenser is just a sort of hollow tube that has cold water on the outside of it, and so as the steam goes through the hole in the middle, it gets cooled down and that helps it to turn back into a liquid as it condenses. The pure water can then be collected at the end in the beaker, and this water won't need sterilising because the same heat that boiled the water will have also killed any microbes that were in it. In reverse osmosis, the salt water is forced through a membrane under very high pressure. In normal osmosis, which is a passive process that you've probably learnt about in biology, water molecules move from a dilute solution, which contains very little salt, to a concentrated solution that contains much more, and you've probably completed a required practical that showed this. Here we use high energy and high pressure to complete the reverse process. The water is forced through the membrane, leaving the salt behind. Time for another progress check. Pause the video and write down answers to these 4 questions. Seawater isn't potable because potable means drinking water, and you can't drink water from the sea because the levels of salt are far too high. They're toxic. The 2 ways that we can carry out desalination are reverse osmosis and distillation. And it's an expensive thing to do because both of these processes are very energy intensive. We don't tend to use desalination in Britain to make drinking water because we've got plentiful supplies of fresh water. The third place that we could get water for making potable water from is wastewater. So urban lifestyles and industry produce large amounts of water that aren't safe to drink straight away, but that can be treated to make them safe, and we can split these up into further types. Sewage is the wastewater from our homes, so not just things that come from toilets, but also things that come from the sink in your bathroom and in your kitchen as well. So it may contain toilet waste, but also detergent from sort of washing up liquid and hand soap, and obviously toilet paper. Both sewage and agricultural wastewater, so wastewater that's come from farms, need you to remove organic matter and also harmful microbes. Then we've also got industrial wastewater from factories, and that may require you to remove organic matter but also harmful chemicals. Sewage treatment includes 4 key steps. The first one, rather like in the groundwater, is screening and grit removal. So again, we've got a fine metal mesh and the water is going to pass through that, and that's going to remove any large objects. Then we have that sedimentation process, which separates out liquids from solids. So you're left with 2 parts. There's a sort of semi-solid goo that we call sewage sludge, and then the liquidy watery stuff on top is called effluent. The sewage sludge is going to be anaerobically digested. So anaerobic, you hopefully know from biology, means without oxygen, and certain bacteria are going to break that down. And then there's also aerobic biological treatment of the effluent. Rather than just describing how to make potable water from a particular source, you could be asked to evaluate which source is easier to make water from. So remember, any time that you have an evaluate question in your GCSE Science exams, you need to be comparing and writing a conclusion. So here I want to talk about what the processes are involved in making potable water from each of these sources, and then decide which one I think would be easiest or cheapest. So for the industrial water, there's going to be organic matter and also harmful chemicals that need to be removed, and that might take multiple steps. For the groundwater, I need to filter it and sterilise it, but I would also need to do those steps with the industrial wastewater, so right now groundwater is definitely winning. For the seawater, I need to remove the salt. That's only one step, and I wouldn't really need to sterilise it afterwards because the process of reverse osmosis or the process of distillation would also remove the bacteria. But both of those are very energy intensive and therefore very expensive. So I've concluded that groundwater would be the easiest to make drinking water from because it requires fewer steps and it's cheaper than seawater. Remember, for these evaluate questions, there's not usually a right answer. So if I wanted to say that seawater was the best option because it only had one step, then that would be a valid conclusion as well, and I would still get the marks. So that's everything that you need to know about potable water and how to produce it. I hope that was a useful introduction to you. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos from Unit 10 coming soon.